Hey, Motorman here. Today we're going to talk about, and I've heard a lot of this stuff on the internet and all over the place. Harley-Davidson is on their way out. They're going out of business because their riders are getting too old to ride, and the younger generation isn't buying motorcycles, let alone $20,000 Harley-Davidsons. Well, I don't think that's true, and I'm going to tell you why, because I've been through the upturns and the downturns in the motorcycle market. And by the way, I hope if you like this video or any of the other 800 videos I have on YouTube, please hit that subscribe, give me a thumbs up, click the little bell so you'll be notified every time I come out with a video. By the way, if you just wandered here by chance and you don't know who I am, I'm a motor office instructor. I'm the maker of the Ride Like a Pro video. And I know what you're going to ask is about this new jacket that I have here. This is from Viking Cycle. It is I call this a semi-mesh jacket because it's not fully mesh, and it's fully padded. I mean, there's padding on the chest, on the stomach, on the elbows, the arms, the shoulders, every place you could think of. I'll turn completely around.
Very nice. And I like it. It has the reflective.
You're talking again.
It has the reflective strips.
Yes, it has reflective strip. So yeah, it's black and you want to be seen, but at night you'll be able to see these. They reflect just like the decals that I have on the motorcycles. They're reflective. They're the same thing that comes on police vehicles. And I'm going to show you also, these come with a liner. I call this type of jacket, good up to about 50 degrees. It's not really what I would consider a summer jacket for here in Florida when it's 95 degrees. But when it gets a little cool, down to 50 degrees, this jacket's fine. It comes with a quilted liner, which I'm going to show you right now. And like magic, here's the liner. It's quilted. Again, you could ride with this, if it's 80 degrees out without the liner, it's fine. If you put the liner in, you're probably good down to maybe even 45 degrees, depending on how tough you are. I'm going to put a link to Viking Cycle below, so check them out. The prices are unbelievable. I think this is like $75. I mean, you can't beat that. 75 bucks, and it's not made in China either. But anyway, I highly recommend them. I tried the jacket out. It's very comfortable, fully padded, great safety thing. So come on, let's go for a ride. We'll ride and we'll talk. So lately you hear a lot of, in fact, you see it on YouTube as well, you hear a lot of people talking about Harley-Davidson riders, and they're getting older, and pretty soon they'll be too old to ride a motorcycle. And that is true in some ways, but the sky is not falling, believe me. Now the reason we're stopped here is, take a look at this building. This building was built in about, I'm guessing 1985 or so, and this was the original, or the second Harley-Davidson dealership in Port Richey. That's where we are right now, is Port Richey. The building initially was half this size. It held maybe 3 new motorcycles and 3 or 4 used Harley-Davidson motorcycles, and more or less a bunch of Harley-Davidson clothes and accessories. That was at a time when you couldn't actually get a new Harley-Davidson. You had to put your name on a list. You had to wait 6 months to a year to get one. And this is where the original dealership moved to. And in fact, it stayed here until about, I'm thinking 1995 or so, when the original owner was bought out by a huge car dealership, Furman, and moved to their new location on State Road 54. But just take a look at this and imagine, it was a non-discrete building, or indiscreet building, and just said Harley-Davidson and a couple of motorcycles, and they sold a lot of bikes out of here, a lot of used bikes, especially because at that time I believe you couldn't buy a new Harley-Davidson, or they wouldn't sell it to you unless you had a Harley-Davidson to trade in. So now I'm going to take you down US 19. I'm going to show you the original Harley-Davidson dealership where I first went to back in 1977 when I first moved down here. So come on, we'll take a ride. on US 19 in Port Richey. And I'm going to try to find the original Harley dealership. You're not going to believe it. A lot has changed since 1977. But I think I could find it. Back in 77, there were, I think, only 3 lights in this whole town. I believe this was 1 lane in each direction. The owner back then was a guy named Virgil. I don't remember his last name, and I'm not sure exactly when he purchased the Harley-Davidson franchise, but I'm positive it was pretty cheap, because at that time there was a big downturn in the market, in the motorcycle market altogether, not just Harley-Davidson, but motorcycle sales were way down. So much so that in 1977 there was a Honda dealership. It's still there up in Hudson, about 15 miles north of here. And the motorcycle industry sales were so far down that that Honda dealership didn't even sell motorcycles. They sold lawnmowers and generators. I knew, because back then I think it was, I had a 1976 Honda 750, and I went there to get it serviced. And they said, "Oh, we don't service motorcycles here." I said, "What do you do?" He said, "Well, we sell lawnmowers and generators." But that was about it. So it wasn't just Harley-Davidson having serious sales problems back then, as well as production problems, but the entire motorcycle industry. All right, this is it. This was the Harley-Davidson dealership, and at that time Virgil, the owner, was the owner of the dealership. He was the salesman, and he was the mechanic. He was the only guy working here. They had 1 motorcycle. I think it was a 77 Sportster. That was all they had. That was the entire stock, not even any used motorcycles. Had several bikes that he was working on. There was 1 bay in there that he did the work on it, but this is where Harley-Davidson came from. Now, as it got into the 80s and the later 80s, sales started to go up, and that's when he moved to that building where we just came from. And he was there for quite a few years before it was purchased by Furman. And what had happened was Harley-Davidson started to require a certain amount of square footage. In other words, they wanted the dealerships to be a palace. So I think he did the right thing and sold out. I'm sure he made a pretty penny, because from here to where I'm going to show you the next Harley dealership, it's just amazing how the company had grown and sales had grown. You're too young to remember, Harley-Davidson sales really started to boom about 1990 or so. Demand way outstripped production, and I did a video on this a while back. People were paying over list price, way over list price, just to get their hands on a new Harley-Davidson. Now, at that time, it wasn't just Harley sales that started to skyrocket. It was Honda and Yamaha, Suzuki, Kawasaki. And all those manufacturers wanted to get into the cruiser market as well. And they started making what I would call Harley-Davidson look-alike motorcycles. The thing was, back then, the Kawasaki, I think it was the Vulcan 1500 at the time, was the first one to come out with a real heavyweight motorcycle. They actually were a very reliable, nicely performing motorcycle, better than the Harley-Davidsons at the time. And because There was no dealer markup over manufacturer's list price. In fact, usually you can get a discount. They sold very well. Honda followed suit with the Shadow series. Suzuki had their own version of the Harley-Davidson look-alike. And Yamaha, I think it was about 1998 or 99, they came out with the 1600, which is almost an exact copy of a Harley-Davidson Fat Boy. And the sales were booming all over the place. At that time also the housing market was booming, and you might think, well, what does that have to do with motorcycles? Well, what was happening is the price of homes started to go way up. So people began to have a lot of equity in their homes, and they started advertising the banks and so forth that you could get a home equity loan. And I'm sure that this helped, especially Harley-Davidson. People were able to get $15,000 or $30,000 even home equity loan, like a second mortgage is really what it was, and they would take that money and they would buy a brand new Harley-Davidson. Now at that time, if you wanted a say a Road King, I think list price was around $16,000 or so, which was quite high compared to the Kawasaki Vulcan, which was about $11,000. Same thing with the Honda Ace Tourers were $10,000 or $11,000. But people would, since they got that, and it felt like, I guess, sort of free money, and they would take that $18,000 or $20,000 and they would buy a new Harley-Davidson. They would pay $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 over list. Most dealerships required that you put your name on a list. You put a deposit down of $1,000 or $1,500, and you waited 6 months to a year for your bike to come in. Sometimes it came in the right color that you liked. If it didn't, there was 100 other people on the list, so you better take that bike or somebody else is going to take it. Oddly, at that time, people weren't angry about the dealers charging over list price, and really I don't blame the dealers. If people are willing to pay $5,000 over list price for something, it'd be stupid not to take the money. But people were paying that kind of money. It was almost like people bidding on the motorcycles. And there was a dealership down in, I think down in Clearwater. They're no longer in business. You put your name on the list, put $1,500 down, and that $1,500 didn't go actually towards the price of the motorcycle. That was just the cost to put your name on a list. People were blaming actually the Harley-Davidson Motor Company for their price gouging, but they had nothing to do with it. It was the dealerships, and the dealerships were doing it because, well, people were willing to pay it. And that upturn in the market just kept getting better and better until 2009. I think that was Harley-Davidson's best year, and I'm betting other manufacturers also their best year. After that, the recession hit. Motorcycle sales sunk way down. It was terrible, and people were stuck with motorcycles that they owed a lot more money than they were worth. Supply had met demand. In fact, it met demand about 2005 when they opened up another motor factory, and big twins were easy to come by. And it was almost, it seemed like overnight, the prices, especially for used Harley-Davidsons, sunk. There were people prior to that who were buying up used motorcycles, used Harley-Davidsons. They'd go from Florida with a trailer up to New York or cold northern states, and they'd look in the paper and find late model Harley-Davidsons, low mileage for sale in the wintertime. They'd buy them, pay full retail for them, and then come down and sell them to the dealerships down here because the dealerships didn't have enough new bikes. So they would buy a year or two old bike, and they would actually charge more than what the MSRP was on a brand new Harley-Davidson. But again, it was supply and demand. People were willing to pay it, and the dealerships took advantage of that. So now the recession hits. People are stuck with motorcycles because Harley-Davidson was financing with no money down, the entire MSRP plus sometimes as much as $5,000 over list price. They financed the whole thing. Well, all of a sudden, people couldn't pay for that motorcycle anymore if they financed it. They needed their car much more than they needed a motorcycle, and the market was flooded with used Harley-Davidson. In fact, Harley-Davidson's financial arm, I believe, went bankrupt and was purchased by somebody else, but it took a couple of 3 years before all these used motorcycles were off the market. Now, I just read where I think the median age of a person getting into motorcycling today is 47 years old. That's up from 32 years old in the 90s, and that certainly affects the market. I believe a lot of the reason younger people aren't getting into motorcycling is they're busy with video games, and then as they get a little bit older, the cell phones, kids today, their eyes are stuck to those cell phones, and that's not only hurt motorcycle sales, but I guess sports sales altogether. I remember when I was a kid, you were outside, you were playing baseball or football. There was no soccer back then, but I'm betting that sales of baseball gloves and baseball bats and footballs and even basketballs have fallen way down from what they were prior to video games and the cell phones. Will that change? You know, it's hard to say, but I know that through the years, from the 70s, even the 60s, sales of motorcycles would go up and down. It'd go through a period of 5 or 10 years where sales were good, then they would rise dramatically, then they'd fall dramatically, depending a lot on the economy. And in the capitalist system, we have our ups and downs. It's usually about a 10-year period. Every 10 years or so, we go into a slight recession. Generally, that lasts for a year or two, and then it comes back, and it's booming when it comes back. The only time that didn't occur was with the recession of 2009. It took almost 8 years to fully recover from that recession. But now things are getting better, much better, as a matter of fact. There's actually more jobs available than people available to take them. Wages are going up. Of course, housing prices are going up as well. And we may get into another situation where people start taking second mortgages out on their homes, get that home equity, and buy the toy of their choice, whether that be a motorcycle or an ATV. Yeah, it's hard to say, but Americans like their toys. So I'm betting that it is going to get better. Harley-Davidson is an icon. They are not going to go out of business. In 2017, they had 26% of the motorcycle market, compared to Honda, which is a much bigger company, who I believe had 14% of the market. And that 14% doesn't just count their motorcycle sales, that's ATVs and side-by-sides and dirt bikes. So by far, Harley-Davidson still is the #1 selling motorcycle in the U.S. And I know that, while this is anecdotal, I'm seeing a lot more younger riders come into my class on Harley-Davidsons. I've asked them about that. Many of them started with sport bikes and maybe got too many tickets or almost got killed, and they decided that cruiser type motorcycle was a better way to go. I also see a lot of father and sons, the father being in the 50s and the son being in 18 to 23 years old, and they come to my class, and the father's got a big Ultra or Electra Glide, and the son's got a Sportster, and they'll come back a year later when the son decides he's going to move up to either a Fat Boy, a Dyno, or he'll get a Street Glide. So I think the market is going to be turning around, and no matter what happens, I'm sure that if Harley-Davidson was actually in trouble and going bankrupt, they'd be bought out by a much larger company, whether that be Ford Motor Company or General Motors or any other big manufacturer. I just can't see them ever going out of business. There will always be a market for premium heavyweight motorcycles, in my opinion. I could be wrong, but I've been around for quite a while, and I've seen the ups and downs and seen the changes in the market. In fact, when the boom started in the early 90s, by 2016 we're actually selling more motorcycles overall than they were in the 90s. So it's leveled off and it's rising, and it has its slight ups and downs. I think 2017 to 2018 Harley sales went down about 3.6%, something like that, and then they rose again. And that's just the way it is. It's going to go up and down in that market, but there will always be a market for classically styled heavyweight motorcycles, whether they be from Harley-Davidson or Indian or any of the metric motorcycle manufacturers. This is our local Harley-Davidson dealership in Newport Richey. It's a good sized building. We could probably get, I'm just taking a guess, 70 or 80 motorcycles inside. I'm not going to stop and go inside because I've got 2 cameras on the motorcycle. And it's not that I don't trust bikers. I don't trust anybody. So I could tell you from my life's experiences the way things go in the market, and I pay a lot of attention to it. So I've been into motorcycles since the early 1970s. Sales will go up and they'll go down, but they'll never disappear completely. And if you think of other premium brands in the car industry, like I believe Bentley, which sold extremely expensive cars, they had some problems and they were bought out by BMW. But they also, Bentley or Rolls-Royce, were iconic brands, so they did not disappear. Rover makes the Land Rover, another iconic and very expensive vehicle, was taken over by a larger company. They don't just go out of business, and that's generally what happens. So whether or not you should buy stock in Harley-Davidson, well, that's up to you. There's going to be a lot of ups and downs in the market, and depending upon when you got in, if you got in early in the 1980s or early 1990s, your stocks went crazy up until about 2008 or 2009, and then they went way down. That's just the way the market is. Another thing to think about is right now Harley-Davidson is making the best motorcycles they have ever made. They are superior to what they were making just 10 or 12 years ago, let alone back in the 90s. Now back in the 70s, and I think it was up until 83, when AMF owned Harley-Davidson, yeah, they had some serious problems. Dealers would complain they had practically had to rebuild the motorcycles when they got to the dealership because they were brand new, just leaking oil all over the place, all kinds of quality problems. Then when Harley-Davidson bought the company back, they went public and they came out with the Evolution motor. Things started to change and it's just gotten better from there.